This is the fifth video on the section of evolution. We're going to have a quick look at the concepts of convergence and divergence, and then we're going to look at the process of speciation and specifically of allopatric speciation. So convergence and divergence in evolution, they're associated with the evolutionary paths followed by organisms. So how organisms have evolved, starting sometimes from a common ancestor and sometimes from very different ancestors. So if there's one common ancestor, which we spoke about quite a lot in, I think it was the first evolution video, we talked about homologous structures. So they evolved from a common ancestor, and the structure is very similar, but the animals or the organisms that now use them for very different functions. And the example of this was the pentadactyl limb, where we as humans have pentadactyl limbs, birds have pentadactyl limbs, whales have pentadactyl limbs, horses, lions, a lot of animals. So we see that it comes from a common ancestor many, many years ago, but now it has very different functions. For example, walking, swimming, flying, handling tools, etc. And when we talk about homologous structures and when we talk about having a common ancestor, this would be divergent evolution. So we can see here we started from this parent species and we had some similar structures, but species then evolved differently, possibly because of different environments or just reproductive isolation. And over time, they become two or more very different species. So they might have similar structures, but they use them for very different functions, and they, from the outside, look very different. Then the idea of many unrelated, many different organisms independently developing, so without contact or reproduction between each other, they develop similar adaptations for similar environments. This is known as convergent evolution. So this relates to analogous structures. So they don't have the same common ancestor, but they have the same environment, and because of this, they have similar environmental pressures or selective pressures, which causes them to evolve sometimes structures that are very similar. This would be something like a bird and an insect, where their wings are very different structures, but they both have the same environment of, well, air and flying. So they, in the end, evolved actually quite similar structures, which are the wings, for similar functions. This would be convergent, starting from two very different starting points and becoming something that we can see has similarities, where divergence is the opposite. It starts from a common ancestor and evolves independently to become two or more very different species. As I said, this is just another example to look at the concepts of convergence and divergence. So if we then move on to look at speciation, there are two main types of speciation: allopatric speciation, also called geographic speciation, or sympatric speciation. So the word allopatric means other country. So when we refer to allopatric speciation, that would be speciation where there is some sort of geographic isolation, where the two populations are separated from each other because of some sort of geographic boundary, which could be something like a mountain or a river or an ocean. And they are not only reproductively isolated, but also geographically isolated. They can't even come into contact with each other. So allopatric speciation is when a new species arises from an existing species, so an ancestral species, when the populations, as I said, are separated by a geographic barrier. This is the most common form of speciation, simply because it happens a lot more commonly than sympatric speciation. Because sympatric speciation, it's a lot harder for reproductive isolation to occur, because the organisms are still in the same area and they're not geographically isolated. So a population can be separated geographically by a river, a mountain, ocean, something like a road, if it was obviously smaller organisms, even non-mobile organisms like a plant, by deserts, or by geographical events that cause the separation, something like erosion, earthquakes, volcanism, and continental drift. So the separation results in two populations that develop in isolation from each other, and they're unable to crossbreed because of this geographic barrier. These two populations are then reproductively isolated. This is a really, really important point to include in something like in a paragraph or a flow diagram if you were asked about speciation. There's no gene flow between the two populations, which of course means they're reproductively isolated, and they will then start to evolve independently from each other. The new mutations in each population will lead to new alleles, which results in different gene pools. And one new allele, or one new mutation in one population will not affect the other population because there's no gene flow between the two populations. The environments of the geographical areas differ, so there might be different selective pressures, which are then placed on the population. Natural selection occurs independently in each area, so it doesn't, just because it's happening in one area, doesn't mean the same selective pressures or the same mutations are happening in the other area, and different traits are selected for as beneficial because each environment is different. For example, one environment might have very tall trees, so something like long necks may be beneficial, whereas another environment may just have short little bushes and grasslands, so then organisms wouldn't evolve with long necks. Eventually, the gene pools of the two populations become very different in their phenotype, so in how they look, and in their genotype, so in the actual DNA. Each population adapts to its own unique environmental conditions. And if the populations were then to meet after being geographically isolated, they can no longer reproduce with each other because they are too genetically different. They have been reproductively isolated and there's been no gene flow between the populations. So they have actually evolved into two new species. Now, the important thing to note is that it could be an example like this, where we have an original species A, which then evolves into two new species, species B and species C, all of which are different from each other. Or it could be that something like species A was, the two populations of species A were separated geographically, and it formed something like species C, but instead of forming species B, it remained species A. So the one population remained the same species. They evolved, but not drastically. And the other population evolved very differently and became a separate species. So it doesn't mean that the ancestral species has to necessarily become extinct, but it can. So we can see that speciation occurs in this little diagram that just kind of simplifies it. So we have population A, it's then split into two new populations because of a geographical barrier. These two populations are separate. There's mutation and natural selection that occurs in this new environment, possibly because the environment is very different from the original environment of species A. So the natural selection is kind of accelerated, which then forms this new species B. As I said, over here, it could be that species A doesn't become a new species, so perhaps they have the same environment. So there obviously is natural selection, because there always is natural selection, but not like a lot more than there was here. The rate of natural selection is continuous throughout, which means that we still have the same ancestral species. However, it's now very different from this new species because it's being geographically and then reproductively isolated. There's now no gene flow and they cannot interbreed anymore. The individuals of species A and species B can't, when they do mate, if they can mate, the chromosomes within each gamete can't form homologous pairs in the offspring because they're so different, which means that we can't form a proper zygote and we can't produce fertile offspring. One of the examples of geographic speciation is the Galapagos finches, which is obviously a very common example. They were all separated geographically on different islands, and so they all evolved separately. This is what Darwin proposed. He saw that they were different to the main finch species on the mainland, and he proposed that how they got there, how they got to the islands, was perhaps through strong winds or floating on little pieces of wood through the ocean currents. When they reached the islands, originally there was very little competition because there weren't very many bird species, And this point of little competition is quite an important point to include in your answers, because it relates to the fact that there's very few ecological niches. So the species can adapt and have evolved beneficial traits without being competed for or competing for the same resources as species that are already on the island. So the speciation occurred where the finches were isolated from the original population, obviously because the islands are very separate from the mainland, and they were also isolated from each other on the different islands. They then multiplied and reproduced, and mutations occurred. And sorry about that. One of the main mutations that occurred was this beak size, the variation in beak size that we can see here. Some of these, like the Amakihi, have a very long beak, whereas this Nihoa finch has a short, broad beak. So we can see that this is how this is one of the examples of the adaptations that occurred on the islands. Natural selection resulted in the selection of traits that enabled the finches to adapt to their new conditions. So this would be the beneficial traits, the favorable traits. And the population began to look different from the population on the mainland. So their gene pool changed over time. Some finches flew to the other islands, and then the environment was different, not only from the mainland, but from the island that they were originally on. So there were new niches available. The finches between each island were isolated from each other. And again, the same process occurred. There were different mutations. Natural selection happened. Beneficial traits were selected for. And eventually, the finches on the different islands developed separately and independently, and they differed genetically. So over time, they differed so much that they became unable to crossbreed because there was no gene flow between them, and new species were formed. This genetic variation resulted in a wide range of beak shapes and sizes in the different species. And in the end, over obviously a very, very long time, many, many generations, there were 13 species of finches that are thought to have evolved from one ancestral mainland species. And this we can see as an example of allopatric speciation, because there was geographic isolation between the species. We can see here just an example of how the finches differ very much in phenotype, and then of course in genotype. So some other examples of allopatric speciation would be baobab trees that occur in Africa, in Australia, and on the South Island of Madagascar. So we can see that they all would look very similar, so they must have had a common ancestor at one point. And then, of course, they were geographically isolated between the different continents and different countries. Other examples of proteas that occur in these different areas, and the Galapagos tortoises that, same as the finches, occur on the different Galapagos islands. So this allopatric speciation is, as we said, the most common example of speciation. There is also sympatric speciation, which will be covered in a separate video.